At Wildlands Trust, we work throughout the region of southeastern Massachusetts to conserve and permanently protect native habitats, farmlands, lands of high ecological and scenic value, in order to keep our communities healthy and our residents connected to the natural world. And you can find our preserves all over the region. Our work is to primarily protect land. We have about 10,000 acres in our portfolio. And then once we have that land, we have to take care of it. So we have a whole stewardship department that maintains the trails for people, maintains habitat for wildlife, clean water, etc. Where I come in is I do education and community engagement in the form of public programs like this. We also do youth work across the region, and we help people learn how to use our preserves and stay safe out on the trails. And all of our work relies on collaboration with other towns, other nonprofits, and state agencies across the region that make our work possible. Our membership program, so if you want to join Wildlands Trust and become a member, you can do so at any time throughout the year. It's just $50 per year, and 100% of that donation goes right towards our mission to protecting land. The membership status that you receive also gets you discounts to any paid Wildlands Trust programs, and then also select farms and retailers across the region. And you can find all of that on our website, and I will send you an email tomorrow morning with a few links and some other follow-up information. So this is our service region. Maybe you're from one of these towns. This is over 40 towns that we work in. Maybe you're not, because with Zoom programs, we can welcome people from all over the place, which is really cool. And our headquarters for Wildlands Trust is just down here in South Plymouth. But again, like I said, we work throughout the region and our properties are everywhere. Tonight's program is going to focus on birds. We have the renowned ornithologist Wayne Petersen with us yet again. Wayne serves on our board of directors at Wildlands Trust, and he also works as the director of the Important Bird Areas program for the Mass Audubon. Now, in normal times, we would be out on a field trip this time of year. Here's some pictures from the last few years. And we kind of go all over Plymouth and the surrounding area looking for birds as they migrate, specifically seabirds and waterfowl during this great fall migration that we're going to learn about tonight. But when that, wasn't really possible, as you can see, we share scopes, we get close to each other to look at books. So I thought, oh, this probably isn't like a super COVID-friendly program to do yet. Let's turn it into a virtual program. And Wayne was nice enough to do that for us today on Thursday, October 15th, 2020.
Well, good evening, everyone. And Rachel said it's nice to see everyone. It's been so long since I've seen so many of my friends and so many other people. And if I have, they've all had masks on, that this is like talking on the radio as far as I'm concerned, but that's not a problem. Not a disclaimer exactly, but something of an apology. I know that most of you are on the edges of your seat waiting to hear the presidential debates this evening. So I will try to make this a relatively succinct presentation. And before I start, I should give you a little background about why most of what I'm going to be talking about here is going to involve sea ducks. A lot of you, I suspect, are from the immediate South Shore area, and you have either been to or you're aware of the existence of the Manomet Bird Observatory, which is now simply called Manomet. And I should point out that Karen Gray, the director of our esteemed organization, the Wildlands Trust, for a number of years in her earlier career, she worked at Manomet as a key player for a lot of years. So this is kind of a double hitter in a sense. In any case, when Manomet was first established in 1969, one of the things that was deemed as an interesting and appropriate thing for the new observatory to get involved with was a Sea Watch program. It's called Operation Sea Watch. And that was to capitalize on the fact that there was a heavy offshore sea duck migration that passed Manomet Point every autumn, and had been a place where hunters and gunners used to shoot sea ducks with great regularity and great interest. And it was a spot where birders would go to observe stuff because you get the benefit of a nice high bluff and you can see all of Cape Cod Bay, and on clear days you can see the Provincetown Monument out at the tip of the Cape. It's really a spectacular venue, but a particularly appropriate place to observe autumn seafowl migration. So some of my particular interest in scoters primarily, but all the sea ducks, goes way back to those early years when I was involved in directing the Sea Watch program at Manomet. So with that in mind, let me take you to the next level here. Let's see. There we go. And I want to offer sort of a few points to ponder as we move through the presentation here, which, as I said, is not going to be extensive, and it's not going to be a treatise on either bird migration or field identification or bird biology or anything else. It's really just going to be sort of a layman's look at a phenomenon that is really spectacular and has had quite a history on the South Shore, not just at Manomet, but all up and down the coast, from Cohasset and Hull, right down to the canal, and certainly out on the Cape. So one of the things I think that's interesting to consider is, where are the migrating water birds that we see during the summertime? The fact that they're obviously on the move, there's a pretty good and intuitive sense that they're probably coming from points to the north, since they're headed south. What may be less obvious is the routes that they follow in order to get to the latitude of Manomet and Cape Cod Bay and so forth. Where are their terminal winter destinations? In other words, how far are they going to go when they pass Manomet, for example? How much further are they going to go? Are they just going to go down into Cape Cod Bay? Are they going to hang out around the Cape, or are they going to go arguably further? And then finally, like people traveling anywhere, food is always a necessity. And if you're a long distance migratory duck or other water bird, you've got to figure out, okay, how am I going to get enough energy to get where I'm going? Which then begs the question, what do they eat and how do they find it? How do they get it? So in sort of moving along here, I think it's appropriate that you kind of think about those several bulleted points there. If we take a continental view of waterfowl migration, there's a couple of different ways to think about it, or I should say perhaps that it has been thought about by earlier ornithologists and naturalists and birders and things who sort of track the movements of birds over the landscape over long spans of time. One of the earliest sort of conceptual descriptors was to refer to flyways. The flyway concept is something that it lingers today, although, as I'll show you in a moment, it's been refined considerably. But essentially, the rationale behind the flyway concept was that if one tracks the places where the largest numbers of ducks and waterfowl sort of move seasonally through, there's a discreteness to those movements. And the discrete entities that were ultimately defined and described were the Atlantic flyway, which is shown in sort of olive green, the Mississippi flyway, the Central flyway, which comes down through the Rockies and the western edge of the Great Plains, and then the Pacific flyway, which includes everything starting in Alaska and continues down to Baja, Mexico. So if you sort of take the map in its grandest scape like this, you could get the sense that the Central flyway, in fact, is the most important. And now we get to the question, well, important for what species? Because needless to say, not all species are using all the flyways with equal abundance. In fact, some species are only using one or two of the flyways, and some of them are, much more broad base, shall we say. But I think the one thing that you'll note just from this map alone is that if you look at the Canadian border, trace it from west to east, you'll see that all the flyways essentially have their genesis in Canada and the Canadian Arctic. And that's sort of key to that question, where are they coming from? That's where a great many of these birds, in fact, are getting their start. Now, I mentioned that the concept of flyways has over time been refined considerably. And in point of fact, one of the terms that's often used to describe the movements of waterfowl, particularly ducks, is migratory corridors. And each of these slender colored lines, in fact, represents a very sort of crude sense of some of the more important migratory corridors. And you'll see that there's a lot of variation in what the corridors do. For example, if you look at the blue line here, if you sort of trace that line, it goes in a couple of different directions. It goes down the Pacific coast, but then it sort of diverges in northern South America. And then you pick it up again on the East Coast, and it goes down the Atlantic coast, crosses over the Sargasso Sea, and then hits, the coast of Brazil and northern South America. And ultimately, it takes some of the birds all the way to southern South America. But then in the middle of the country, there's all these things that look like part of a circulatory system, all these red lines. And a lot of species are using those various points and so forth. So the point is that the flyway concept is useful, but it's certainly not as precise as one can derive by looking at maps that really delineate these migratory corridors. And there are references where this information is pretty well spelled out, and you can kind of get a sense of the significance of the corridors by looking at the thickness of the lines in the diagrams, or there'll be a key that will tell how many thousands of birds are thought to use those flyways, or rather corridors, one way or another. But that's in a general way. I think that affords sort of a sense in terms of how waterfowl generally are moving, and that they're moving in various directions across the country. And I should point out also that most of what I'm going to be talking about here has to do with autumn migration. And for some species, the spring and the fall migration routes are different. Just like with songbirds and passerines, things like orange-crowned warblers and Connecticut warblers and species of that sort are primarily autumn migrants in Massachusetts. We don't see them in the spring at all. The same is true for shorebirds. There are lots of shorebirds that are much more numerous in the fall than they are in the spring. And when I say much more numerous, I mean only relatively speaking. So species like the Hudsonian godwit or the buff-breasted sandpiper, they almost don't show up at all in the spring, because their migration is very different in the spring than it is in the autumn. So the same is true with some of the waterfowl, but it's not quite as dramatic as it is with some of the passerine species, the songbirds, or some of the shorebirds. So let's take a look at a really, I say familiar, and maybe not familiar to all of you, but this is a duck that right now is passing the coast of Massachusetts, particularly on days particularly favorable for migration, when it's possible to see hundreds. And on really good days, you might see several thousand. This is the white-winged scoter. There are 3 species of scoters, and as I mentioned, my interest in these ducks really began when I started volunteering and then spending a lot of time at Manomet when I was heading up the sea duck program, or the Sea Watch. And scoters were the main sort of fodder, shall we say, for the mill. So I began to really take an interest in the three species. This, the white-winged scoter, the next one that I'm going to talk about, the surf scoter, and then the third one, the black scoter. These white-winged scoters are, of the three, arguably the easiest to identify because both the males and the females, this is a drake, this is a male white-winged scoter, all have a very conspicuous large white wing patch, and otherwise they're all just like they just stepped out of a barbecue pit. And that's true for virtually all the scoters. Body-wise, they're pretty much black. The females are a little different. They're more brownish in color, and they have some facial smudges on the side of their head. The adult males, like this one, have that little white teardrop marking around the eye. So basically, you're talking about an all-black duck with a white wing patch and a little teardrop in the male white-winged scoter. And these are big ducks. These are hefty. They're about as large as anything other than an eider. And I'll talk about eiders in a few minutes. But a flock of scoters on the water, you know, even if you don't have a telescope and only have binoculars or even naked eyes, if you got sharp eyes, you know, they just look like big black blocks of floating wood that have been sort of charred. But if you look at the range map for the white-winged scoter, you'll see that, like I mentioned, for all the birds I'm going to talk about, a lot of them get their start in Western Canada, extending all the way up into Alaska, and just a few of them spill over into the northern plain states, Montana, North Dakota, Washington State. Sadly, with the drainage of the prairie potholes that are so important to breeding waterfowl in Canada and in the prairie provinces and prairie states of Western North America, the United States, the white-winged scoter probably is one of the ones that has taken the heaviest hit, simply because if you look at their distribution, they were never really that common there. So white-winged scoters as breeders in the United States these days, outside of Alaska, are practically a non-entity, but the center of their distribution is as shown in that orange map. If you look down into the area of the Great Lakes, you'll see that there's yellow coloration. The yellow on these maps that I'm going to be showing you, and by the way, these maps are taken from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's All the Birds website, where you can get distribution maps, you can get great photos of males, females, the whole 9 yards, and a lot of good information, but that's where these maps are from. In any case, so the thing that you want to note here is that white-winged scoters are actually pretty common in the Great Lakes, and even in the St. Lawrence River. You can see that little sliver of yellow going up north of the Gaspé Peninsula in Maine, if you're familiar with that, you know, Atlantic Canada. So the implication is pretty clear here. Even though we sometimes see thousands of white-winged scoters, particularly in the winter, because for white-winged scoters, Massachusetts and the waters around Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket represent a fairly significant terminal destination for them. In other words, once they've made the flight from Western Canada to the Atlantic coast, a lot of them, you know, that's where they're going to stop. But if you look at the blue lines on the map, you'll see that a lot of them also continue all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico. They don't all necessarily come the whole way down the coast. Some of them will cross country, but the blue is pretty characteristic of where the majority of the autumn flight goes. So that's the white-winged scoter, and in many respects, certainly in Massachusetts, in the winter, for the most part, it's our commonest scoter. That is to say, it's the scoter that most people are most apt to see. And I'll come back to why that's the case in a few minutes. But Generally speaking, we are a major winter holdout for white-winged scoters. You can see them all the way from, Plum Island and Essex County around Cape Ann. You can see small numbers in outer Boston Harbor, and then you can see them certainly during migration along the South Shore numbers. But the real numbers are often sort of hidden from view, and this is part of why the winter abundance of scoters is sometimes a little difficult to track, because many times they're literally out of sight of land. A lot of them will winter on the Nantucket Shoals, or they'll winter, a mile or more off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, anywhere where there is sufficient appropriate habitat. And again, for most of these scoters that I'm talking about here, that means mollusks, and very precisely in many cases, blue mussels. That's the thing that they make a living off of. So where they concentrate for the winter is typically where there's plenty of the appropriate molluscan prey that they dive for. And they have to be over shoal waters because, yes, they're powerful divers and go quite a depth, but at the same time, they have to be able to get to bottom. And well, I'll come back to mussel biology in a few minutes. So that's the white-winged scoter, and that's a real major player. They're often one of the first scoters to show up. The vanguard often appears sometime in the middle of September, and the peak is right about now. Literally, if you go out tomorrow, you're probably going to be able to see some white-winged scoters going by or sitting in the water or whatever. And if the wind turns north and northeast, you could see a lot of them, but then you could see a lot of the others too. So let me move on here. This is the surf scoter. And as you can sort of see from the white patches on the front and back of the head, this was a bird that hunters and sportsmen and market gunners and things often nicknamed skunkheads because of the black and white pattern on the head. And they have a very colorful bill, quite a distinctive bill when you get a close look at it. The males are all black, like all scoters. They don't have any white wing patches. And in this case, the female surf scoter, if you can imagine a head pattern very similar to what you see with these two male surf scoters, that's very similar to what the head pattern of a white-winged scoter looks like, a white-winged female. But she'd have that big white wing patch just like the male. So with surf scoters, one of the really leading field marks, certainly on the males, is to see those white head patches. And if the birds are close enough that you can get a good look at them and see that they're females and don't have a white wing patch, then you can take them to the bank as female surf scoters. And as their name suggests, they very often will feed right in the surf, just outside where the waves are breaking. And the interesting thing about these birds is that, again, if you look at the range map here, they have what we call a disjunct breeding population. That is to say, it's not a continuous area the way we saw with the white-winged scoter. So there's the majority of the population is breeding in the same general boreal forest area and tundra areas that the white-winged scoters were nesting, up in Alaska and then up into the northern provinces of Canada and so forth. They don't dip down as far as the white wings and never have nested in the United States other than in Alaska. But then their population sort of peters out as you get toward Hudson Bay, which is that big white bay area in northern Ontario, Canada, and Manitoba. But then it picks up again on the east side of Hudson Bay and James Bay, which is that little white tail hanging off the bottom of Hudson Bay. So if you look at the orange areas where surf scoters occur during migration, that kind of hints at the fact that they can occur on both coasts, and in fact they do. The surf scoter is actually the most numerous scoter on the West Coast, and anywhere from California all the way down to Baja, you can see big numbers of surf scoters, in San Francisco and Monterey, places where you get, big concentrations of ducks. Surf scoters are typically one of the species that's bound to be there. So you also see that, like the white-winged scoters, they occur in the Great Lakes. And then there are these blue lines that extend all the way down the coast. So there's a bit of a mystery, or let's say an unsolved question about where all the surf scoters come from that we see on the Atlantic coast. Because from what the literature tells us and from what's known about the breeding ecology of surf scoters in Labrador and places to the east of James and Hudson Bay there, that population is not an immense population. It's not like, you know, they're on every little lake and pond in the tundra forest and boreal forest. They're pretty scattered, and they're quite actually scarce. So then you look at the fact that they're common in the Great Lakes and in the interior, and then you see the blue lines picking up going down the coast again. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But of the 3 species of scoters that we have in Massachusetts, if you go down to Manamet Point, the next day that we have a good east wind or a northeast wind, it's very likely that the surf scoter is going to be the most abundant species that you see. This wasn't always the case. And one of the reasons that Manamet Bird Observatory was interested in scoter migration was because not only did we have access to lots of scoters here, but the former state ornithologist Joseph A. Hager, Archie Hager, back in the 1930s, he had quite an interest in scoters as well. And he had several significant years of careful monitoring of scoter flights at Manamet and then down along the north shore of Cape Cod Bay and then all the way out to Provincetown. And it was very clear from his work and his observations that the white-winged scoter was far and away the most numerous. That situation has sort of reversed itself, and the surf scoter now is arguably more numerous in Massachusetts as a migrant than the white-wing. But again, if you remember what I said about the breeding range of the white-winged scoter, in many respects, their population has been much more vulnerable to development and all the things going on, not just in the northwestern United States, but even in southern Canada, the area where a lot of their breeding distribution was. So it's quite possible that their decline has in fact is sort of registered just by intuition looking at this map. So the point is, the question really is, so how do all these surf scoters that we see on the coast of Massachusetts, where are they coming from if that population that would seemingly be the most logical as a source isn't that great, relatively speaking? And the answer is really pretty straightforward. It means that a lot of the surf scoters that we see on the Atlantic coast are coming all the way from Western Canada to get to the Atlantic coast. Then when they get to the coast, you know, they turn south and they start to move down the shore in pulses. This is one of the things about sea duck migration that's quite interesting. They're moving all the time at this time of the year, and you can go out and see them almost under any conditions other than bluebird southwest wind, where you may see them sitting around in the water. But basically, they're looking for a tailwind that's going to drive them toward the coast and then down the coast. So hence the northwesterly piece can be a good tailwind for them to get them to the East Coast. And then they may pile up north of Massachusetts, north of even Maine. A lot of them will come out through the St. Lawrence River mouth and then come down past Newfoundland and then, you know, begin to swing south on their route to this direction. And again, I said in the wintertime, surf scoters generally are not all that common compared to white wings, but some of that is due to the fact that they also are offshore and accordingly are probably undercounted, not probably, in fact, undercounted. And I can say this with a certain degree of confidence in that when Cape Wind, which I'm sure a lot of you recall was a major project that was being considered for the waters off Nantucket, 15 or 20 years ago, one of the concerns was that these windmills could be a problem for certain sea ducks. But as part of that effort to monitor the sea ducks and get a handle on where they really were concentrating, there was a lot of survey work done that included aerial survey work. And that really revealed the fact that there were lots more scoters in addition to white-winged scoters out on those Nantucket shoals and in parts of Nantucket Sound than any Christmas bird counts or land-based observations would suggest. So that's part of the mystique about these things, is how far they're coming from before we see them. And it's probably likely that a lot of them, as I suggested, once they hit the Atlantic coast of Canada and St. Lawrence and all, they form these big rafts in the early part of the fall. They may stay there for a week or 10 days, waiting for the right conditions to move them along. And that's when we get these big pulses further south. You know, northeasterly storm, birders run to the coast to look for seabirds and things, and they're always complaining about the fact that there's these huge clouds of scoters going by. Well, that's because the scoters are taking advantage of the conditions that might be viewed as adverse to seabirds, but certainly are appropriate for migrating ducks. So let me move on to the third amigo here. This is the black scoter, and this is actually my favorite. Black scoters are beautiful birds. I mean, yeah, they're all black and they have a big yellow knob on their bill. But believe me, if you get a nice look at a black scoter, it's a sight to behold. They're the smallest of the three scoters. The white wing is the big chunker. And the males are, as I said, all black. And the only thing that really distinguishes them at a distance is the fact that they have this big yellow, yellowish orange blob on top of their bill. Subtly, they also have sort of a silvery sheen under their wings that when the light is right, you get a sort of a two-tone wing lining to black scoters that doesn't show up on surf scoters, because as you can see, the problem is differentiating between black scoters and surf scoters. White wings always show that big white wing patch. And the female black scoter, if you look carefully at it and think about what a black duck looks like, look a lot like a black duck. They have sort of a dark cap and a pale buffy cheek. They don't have those light patches that the female surf scoters and the female white-winged scoters have. And they're a little bit more mobile on the wing. Because they're smaller, they seem to be a little bit more maneuverable, and you often, if you see them coming like at Manomet, you're always sort of looking north up toward Duxbury Beach and Marshfield and all. You can pick these flocks up coming in at a great distance. And with binoculars or a telescope, just by watching the way the flocks behave often gives you a pretty good clue whether they're black scoters or surf scoters. And the white wings are, you know, because of their white wing patches, they're pretty straightforward at a great distance. But if you look at the map here, you see that the black scoter, in fact, is the least common, not just here in Massachusetts, but in fact, overall, its range is much more reduced. It has that same disjunct component, that is to say, there's the the Arctic group that breeds in Alaska. A lot of them breed in Alaska and along the north slope of Alaska. And then if you come east to Hudson Bay and James Bay area, to the west of Hudson Bay, there's another big subset of black scoters. But again, their numbers, compared to the numbers of surf scoters that we see, have to be greater than surf scoters, which again is sort of an anomaly when you think about it. And then if you look at where they go, they also show up on the Great Lakes. In fact, here in Massachusetts, of all the three scoters that we sometimes see in autumn, particularly in mid to late October and early November, when scoters occasionally will drop into big lakes here on the South Shore, you know, the Lakeville Ponds, for example, Billington Sea in Plymouth, and then, you know, Quabbin Reservoir, Wachusett Reservoir, and some of the lakes in the Berkshires. Yeah, black scoter is invariably the one that's the most numerous. And William Brewster, the premier Cambridge ornithologist who was the first president of Mass Audubon, spent a lot of time up on Lake Umbagog between Maine and New Hampshire, the big lake up in sort of northern Maine and western New Hampshire. And he took a great interest in the birds there, and he wrote a book, The Birds of Lake Umbagog. And he took a lot of interest in scoters, and he's got some fascinating accounts of black scoters that would drop into Umbagog, presumably birds that were leaving the James Bay area and were flying toward the Massachusetts coast or the Maine coast, and would drop in and would spend sometimes just a day on the lake, and other times they might spend several days depending on the weather. And then they would depart almost always at dusk and in the evening. And that's an interesting source of information about scoter migration. There's another sort of early account that has some good information about the way scoters behave inland, and it was called The Birds of Buckeye Lake by Milton Troutman. And Buckeye Lake is in Ohio. He also was somebody who took a real interest in scoters and their migration and would track their comings and goings. So what Archie Hager did, and what I did, and what others who have studied scoter migration, waterfowl migration, you begin to piece together the various components of their migration, how it works, how the birds behave, and so forth. One of the things that is abundantly obvious is that they are very reluctant to take off and cross land during the daytime. So that if you think about Cape Cod and picture that great big arm sticking out into the Atlantic Ocean to the east, as scoters come down the coast past Manamet, you know, a lot of them, they're flying, they can see the ocean on the other side of the Cape. And once they get down to the canal area, if a place like Sandy Neck and Barnstable, for example, is a great place to watch scoters, because they're moving west to east instead of north to south, the way you see them at Manamet. But what happens is, as white-winged scoters, surf scoters, and black scoters, everything I'm saying now applies to all of them. Once they get into Cape Cod Bay, they suddenly seem to get the impression that they're in a cul-de-sac. Because if they start moving lateral to the coast, going east, pretty soon they're going to run into the Orleans ashore, and then if they turn left in Orleans and Eastham, then they're going to start moving up into Wellfleet Bay and so forth. So what they ultimately do is they typically, on days well, I'll say an average flight, not necessarily on the days of the biggest flights, but you'll see them eventually flying from a place like Barnstable at Sandy Neck. If you look due north, you can see scoters coming from your left, that would be the west, flying east along the north side of the Cape. And then if you look further offshore, you'll see flocks coming back in the other direction. So it's like a big gyre. And what these things do, if you watch them very carefully, which I did for many days and many weeks over the course of several years, they eventually settle down and form these large rafts offshore, usually about a mile or so north of the mouth of Barnstable Harbor. And they just stay there for the daytime. But consistent with the observations of some of the early naturalists and gunners, you know, these gunners kept very immaculate hunting records and accounts of how many birds they shot and how the birds were behaving and so forth. It turns out that what a lot of those scoters do, sometimes thousands of them that are in these big rafts offshore on a day when there's a lot of them coming south, they're going to wait until dusk. And then if you're down in the Barnstable parking lot of at Sandy Neck Beach or something, you'll start to see flocks of scoters getting off the water and sort of flying toward you. That would be toward the beach, toward the north side of the Cape. And they'll often go out over Barnstable Harbor, and then they'll turn back and they'll start sort of gyrating around like they really don't know what they want to do. The bottom line is, if you go back to that same viewing spot in the morning, those big flocks on the ocean are gone. And it's unequivocal that a lot of the scoters, because of this reluctance that William Brewster noted at Lake Umbagog, to depart during the daytime. He'd see them come in, first thing in the morning and spend the day on the lake, and then he'd see them leave at dusk. I think their behavior is very similar in terms of the way most of them navigate the Cape. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't cross over the Cape. Sometimes they do. Sometimes you'll see flocks of scoters crossing, usually near the canal. There's a place, there's a road on the Mid-Cape Highway. Some of you may be aware of it, Chute Flying Hill. Archie Hager told me that Chute Flying Hill is so named because under the right conditions, scoters, as well as migratory shorebirds in some cases, were actually close enough to the ground that they could be shot from what amounts to the median strip on the Mid-Cape Highway. But that hill is high enough that sometimes the birds would be within shotgun range, hence the name Chute Flying Hill. So if you ever wonder about the origin of that it's well-founded. But you don't see scoters do that very often. But on days when there are these big flights, that's when you're more apt to see some of them go right over the Cape near the canal or somewhere just to the east of the canal. So now we've got sort of a picture of scoters, what they do, where they're coming from, and some of the mystery associated with how particularly a lot of the black scoters that are much more numerous on the East Coast than on the West Coast, how they manage to get all the way across from Alaska, which is really the headquarters of their breeding range, even though that big brown lob in eastern Canada looks pretty extensive. There's a lot more of them breeding in the West. So they've got to make their way all the way across the country before they hit the East Coast and then begin to turn south and head for the wintering quarters. Black scoters are remarkably common in Massachusetts in the winter, but again, I don't think we really realized how common they are until we were doing these sea duck flyovers during the research background monitoring efforts for Cape Wind. But again, they're out of sight of land, and because they're much harder to identify from an airplane than white-winged scoters, for example, or even surf scoters. The male surf scoters with their white head patches are pretty conspicuous. But so there again, another sort of mystique. But again, Brewster's observations in Lake Umbagog give us a pretty good clue that, they're coming overland, and what they do to get them from Alaska to, sort of central Canada, that's a lot of flying for birds that don't particularly like to take off at night. Doesn't mean to say that they don't migrate over land during the daytime. My point is that they don't like to depart over land during the daytime. They make their departures in the evening. Maybe I should ask the question now, Rachel, if anybody has any questions about anything I've said, because I'm going to move on to some other species here, and their stories are sufficiently different that I don't want to muddy the waters. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if you don't, you can save them, or you can go get a beer or some shrimp or do whatever you're going to do.
So I have a hand up. I have Rob McDonald. Go ahead, Rob.
Hello, Wayne. Just curious, the rafts you talk about, would they contain all three varieties?
They could, yes.
They would. Okay.
In fact, Rob, that's a good question. Something I should have pointed out, even because I've dealt with these three scoters sort of separately. They freely mix, so that on a good migration day at Manamet, for example, you might have a flock of 150 coming by. You could have a mix of all three species. And sometimes there'll be some other ducks that'll mix in with them. Eiders will do that later in the season. Long-tailed ducks will do it. One of the freshwater ducks that, curiously enough, is probably the most frequent traveler with scoters is green-winged teal. And you wouldn't think those little guys that have no particular interest in the ocean would travel with them, but apparently they hook up with the scoters somewhere along the line, and scoters are really significantly powerful flyers. I guess, you know, I'm not a hunter and have no interest in it, but in terms of having watched sea duck hunting taking place off Manamet, more in the early, in recent years, it's been a long time since I've seen anybody out there shooting, but it was a cooperative venture where they'd often put boats out in sort of a crescent configuration, and the gunners would be in the boat. They were shooting, you know, from a rocking boat. So they would try to lure the birds in various ways. In some cases, they'd use decoys, which for scoters, I don't think they're the brightest bulbs in the string. A block of wood, a string of blocks of dark wood would often be sufficient to get their curiosity, or simply a shotgun shot fired up in the air, and the scoters would often, you know, they'd take a dip and they might come in the direction of the boat. But the point is that they apparently are very difficult to hunt because of the fact that, you know, if the sea conditions are in any way rough and you're in a small boat, that adds to the challenge of trying to lead a fast-flying, heavily built duck and bring it down. So I suspect that one of the things about the green-winged teal is they may be among the few waterfowl that are fast enough to keep up with scoters, you know, for an extended period. But I don't know that for certain, but I think it could very well be the case. But there's a whole literature of you know, market gunning and sport shooting, or under the guise of sport shooting, of sea ducks and things, particularly around Nantucket and the Cape and on the South Shore. Cohasset was a big area. Manamet Point was a big area. And if you sort of delve into waterfowl hunting, you get some great information. Arthur Cleveland Bent's Life Histories of North American Birds, you know, the waterfowl volumes, or Edward Howe Forbush's 3-volume Birds of Massachusetts that was done in the 1920s. His accounts of scoters often include a lot of descriptions about how they were hunted. But the bottom line is they're tough to shoot, tough to kill, and tougher to eat. There's some wonderful stories about making scoter stew that have to do with an old shoe and a scoter, and you boil the two of them in a pot for however long, and you add your vegetables, and then you throw the scoter away and you eat the shoe. So unless you're apparently a good chef and know how to prepare them, they're not great. I've never eaten scoter. I've eaten eiders, and they're not a real gourmet treat either. But so apparently the big thrill is in the sport of trying to shoot them. But it also is difficult, if you think about it, in many cases, to retrieve them. Who's going to put their lab over the side to swim around out off Manamet Point on a November day to try to fetch a scoter? So if they don't kill it, it's probably a goner, in that, you know, it's maimed and that's the end of it. I don't mean to paint a dark picture of hunting sea ducks, but I think there is a dark side to it. But yes, the short answer to your question is, Rob, they freely mix, and you'll often see all 3 species together, and sometimes other species of ducks as well, one of which is very often eiders. So unless there are any other immediate questions, let me move on here.
I don't have any other hands up or any other questions
Okay,
in the chat.
very
so
good.
Let's do that.
So if you look at the range of the common eider, you're struck by the fact, yikes, these things are really very maritime. Indeed, they are, of all the sea ducks, the most maritime. In other words, the others that breed in the boreal forests on tundra lakes and ponds and so forth, eiders don't. Eiders basically are nesting right on the coast, usually within sight of the water, or there'll be ponds on the tundra coast. So they don't really have to go very far. Once their ducklings hatch, they can practically waddle to the ocean, and that's where they spend their time. And that's the way we see them here in Massachusetts. I've been birding since I was about 12 years old, and that was a long time ago. And to this date, I've yet to see a common eider on fresh water in Massachusetts. That's how unusual they are inland. If anybody ever finds an eider on a pond, give me a call, because I'd love to see it. In any case, unlike the scoters at Lake Umbagog in Maine that Brewster described, he wasn't seeing eiders. And that's the case in virtually all of the interior lakes. And if you look at the migration lines, you'll see that here on the East Coast, they pretty much stop in New England. And indeed, we are the winter terminus for a great many of the common eiders that winter on the Atlantic coast in the US. There's a lot of them in Canada and Newfoundland and places like that, but they're not the big deal that the scoters are, for example, all over the place. But they are similarly offshore. Big flocks of eiders, rafts of eiders, that's the term they use to describe big flocks of many thousands. They can cover like a mile of ocean surface. And they're over these mussel beds because, like I said, for the scoters, eiders are the premier mussel eaters. They love blue mussels, so they have to cover areas where there's huge numbers of mussels on the bottom. Right now, in recent years, Chatham Harbor has been a huge concentration area for eiders. So if you want to see eiders at close range in huge numbers, go out to some of the points in North Chatham and look out, and you'll see big flocks of them out there. And as you can sort of imagine, because blue mussels are a big delicacy and a cash crop for a lot of shell fishermen, they're not big on these big, huge flocks of eiders that have developed out there because the mussel beds have built up since the breaches that have taken place on North Beach. And so it's one of those cause and effect things. So you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. But in any case, eiders aren't generally hard to find, and they're not hard to see. The males are white-backed and black underneath. They're one of the few ducks that have that sort of reverse counter shading where they're darker underneath than they are on top. And if you think about stalking a mussel, it's not that hard. Mussels don't move around very much. And in fact, one of the things that makes it challenging for any of the sea ducks that feed on mollusks and mussels is that these byssal threads that the mussels produce attach them very tightly to one another and to the rocks in the bottom. So in addition to having to go down and dislodge the whole mussel, break it loose from its point of anchorage, then they have to swallow the whole shell. In other words, these mollusk eaters, they have a very powerful gizzard, which is like a proventriculus in their digestive system, their gizzard. They crush the shells in their entirety and swallow the whole thing. So that because eiders frequently come out of the water, I'm sure a lot of you have seen eiders sitting around on rocks and things. If you're in a place where you can get to places where the eiders, are come out of the water at low tide, you'll often see these little piles of broken clamshells and things, or mussel shells. Those are the droppings of eiders. In other words, they are really hardcore ducks, but they're quite interesting. These breed in Massachusetts now, as I suspect a lot of you know. There's quite a population in Boston Harbor, and fewer, but still quite a few up on the North Shore around some of the rocky islands up there, and they nest in Buzzards Bay. So we're right at the southern terminus of their breeding range, but it's interesting that they didn't always do that, and they have expanded their range considerably to include Massachusetts. But up along the coast of Maine, I'm sure a lot of you have seen eiders, and in the summer you see big groups of big brown ducks and little brown ducks. Those are probably eiders, because eiders are very delinquent in terms of their male responsibilities. The male eiders leave very shortly after getting the females set up on nests, and they actually will often molt long distances from where their breeding colonies are, sometimes 150 or more miles in some areas, to get to these big bachelor groups where the males then go through their eclipse molt and take on a plumage that's more like that of the females, but not totally. And so what the females are left with all these babies, and they're not getting any help. So what they do is they bring their young into these giant groups or creches, as they're called, and it's a daycare system where the female eiders several adult females will often shepherd, large numbers of downy chicks around that are the product of probably several different breeding pairs and so forth. Kind of interesting. Maine is a great place to see eiders and really appreciate what they're up to. In Massachusetts, it's a little harder because the ones in Boston Harbor, they're usually around the outer islands, and it's not as easy to get a good look at them, but it's amazing. The little ones can dive right away. As soon as they get to the water, they're off and running. I mean, they can dive under the water and they bob up. They don't need much help other than just being sort of shepherded and that kind of thing. If you look at this picture, you'll notice that the female there behind the male is just all sort of cinnamon brown, rusty brown. And it may not show on your computer, but they have a barred plumage. If you are really observant, and I'm sure most of you have already picked it out, the bird in front of the male common eider is actually a female king eider. And now you say, yeah, sure it is, Wayne. But in point of fact, if you look really carefully at the structure of the bill and the sort of smooth roundness of the head, instead of that kind of triangular look of the female common eiders that have those big sort of olive lobes or orangey lobes going up almost to the eye, which is a hallmark of female common eiders. In the king eider, the bill is smaller and stubbier. And this is a much rarer bird. You're lucky if you see one or two king eiders in the winter in Massachusetts. And I always like to say, when people say, well, are we going to see any king eiders? Well, I tell them, you got to kiss a lot of ugly toads before you meet the charming prince, meaning that you've got to scan through huge flocks of common eiders in many cases before you find a king eider. And if it's a female, then it becomes even more challenging. But the bottom line is, I think, that I wanted to show you here is common eiders are in many cases coming from a very long way. But in point of fact, a lot of them don't go as far as the scoters do. And if you notice on the West Coast, they're pretty uncommon. They really are. But a lot of them winter in Alaska, all the way out onto the Aleutian Islands and so forth. So a duck that hasn't really started to move yet, but toward the last week of October and then on into early and mid-November are the long-tailed ducks, the ones that used to go by the name old squaw. And these are spectacular. They're beautiful birds. They're very, very agile on the wing. They do a lot of twisting and turning in flight. They have dark wings and these long pointy tails. So when you see a flock of long-tailed ducks going by, they look very white with dark wings. And they're often, the females particularly, get misidentified as alcids, things like razorbills and murres and things. I always think of them as the poor man's alcid. And these guys, while they also feed on mollusks, they also take a lot of amphipods. And again, going back to the Cape Wind situation, because that was really relevant to this discussion, they were the bird, more than any of the other sea ducks, that people were concerned about in the ornithological community because of the huge numbers of long-tailed ducks that spend the winter on the Nantucket shoals. But unlike the others that stay put on the water overnight in pretty much the same areas in most species, these guys would move into Nantucket Sound for the night, and then they'd head back out to the shoals in the morning. So there was concern that depending on where these wind turbines were located, were they going to get in the way of this highway of traveling long-tailed ducks? Well, it turned out that with some transmitter work and so on, we pretty much determined that that would not have been the case. But the long-tailed ducks, for reasons that are slightly unclear at the moment, have really diminished in numbers off Nantucket. It used to be one of the great winter ornithological features in Massachusetts, was to go out to Nantucket in the winter and watch the long-tailed duck flights in the morning and the evening, coming and going in and out of Nantucket Sound. But the key, I think, lies in the fact that those birds on the shoals were feeding mostly on amphipods, which are little crustaceans. They're shrimp-like organisms that occur in the water column. They're not on the bottom like mussels or clams or any of the other mollusks and things. And what they were doing was taking advantage of the concentrating effect of the shoals and packing in these amphipods in ways they were so abundant that, you know, they could support 100,000 or more at a time in the wintertime. And though that was the order of magnitude that was on the shoals at one point. And those numbers, particularly on the Christmas counts now, they've really precipitously diminished in abundance. But it's probable that it's the amphipod supply that is the issue. And that then begs the question about climate change and warming seawater temperatures, which are, you know, unequivocally getting warmer. And there's lots of other things that are being affected by increasing water temperature in terms of both fish, lobsters, you know, that they're not even getting any lobsters out of Long Island Sound anymore because of the increase in the water temperature. And it's affecting things up in the Gulf of Maine. And it may be that that is another one of these secondary effects to climate change as it relates to the ocean that is beginning to really show differences. As far as the distribution in the Arctic, they're a real Arctic bird. They don't breed in the United States anywhere other than Alaska also. And they go way up, as you can see. A couple of the birds that we had transmitters on here in Massachusetts during that Cape Wind research were showing up in some of the islands that you can see right in the upper northern part of Hudson Bay. So they go a long way. And they show up in the Great Lakes in pretty good numbers. You can see from the orange band there, but they don't go too much further than the mid-Atlantic coast here on the eastern seaboard. So that's the long-tailed duck. And the red-breasted merganser. These are probably pretty much all females, although there may be some males that are coming out of eclipse plumage here, but basically they are very rakish in their shape. They fly straight as an arrow. They have a very direct flight. They have kind of a reddish head in the plumage that you see here, which is typical of the females or males that are not in their full breeding plumage, and big white patches on the wings. So you could say, well, couldn't I confuse these with white-winged scoters? Not really. They're nowhere nearly as bulky. They're much more slender. And as I said, they hold their head in a perfectly straight line, and they fly in lines and rows and so forth. They often fly a lot higher than some of the other ducks too. Very streamlined birds. But they have a broad range. They go all the way from you know, northern Alaska and points east all the way up into Atlantic Canada. And you can find them during migration all across the country. They show up inland and big lakes and ponds and things, and they winter all along the coast. You can see them in Florida, down in the Gulf Coast, see them off the coast of Texas. They're really a pretty common bird. But unlike the others that I've been describing, they are piscivores, which means they feed almost exclusively on fish. So they're looking for fish in areas where big schools of fish occur. So for example, here in Massachusetts, in the spring, areas in Cape Cod Bay out near Wellfleet and Truro, out near the mouth of the Pemmit River and some of those areas, sometimes there'll be thousands of red-breasted mergansers that are, you know, waiting for alewives and things that are beginning to line up for their migratory journeys inland. So anywhere where there's a lot of small fish that are in the water column, red-breasted mergansers are going to be chasing them and looking for them. The last couple of birds I'll just mention and wind this up here are loons. Even though they're not sea ducks, they nonetheless are birds that anybody that spends any time at a place like Manamet Point in the fall, you're going to see loons. The red-throated loon is another one of these Arctic breeders. It's coming from a long way away, and you can see from the brown on the map there that they're found, you know, way up north, and then down into Alaska and so forth. And then they move down through the Great Lakes, and they also reach the coast of, you know, the northeastern United States. In fact, if you were to take it, you know, month by month or do a daily login of loons in Massachusetts, the red-throated loon is arguably our most common loon in Massachusetts. Most people don't even recognize them. And the fact of the matter is, unlike the common loon, which is the one that, you know, breeds on the northern lakes and in central Massachusetts and so forth, red throats are much more gregarious. They travel in big flocks. And sometimes you'll see 20, 30 red-throated loons in a loose aggregation traveling together. Sometimes they're low over the water, sometimes they're high, but they're much paler gray and much slimmer necked with a much slimmer bill, very gleaming white underneath, and their feet aren't nearly as large and sort of obvious as on a common loon. So this is another one of these things that's a bird that you almost certainly can find if you put in your time. And sometimes there'll be big numbers of them in the water. Sometimes right off Plymouth Beach, there'll be a lot of them right on the beach, frankly, feeding in the surf. You can walk down the beach and just look them eye to eye. But that slender, light gray neck, they're sort of speckled on the back like somebody took a salt shaker to their back. And unfortunately, they don't have a red throat in the winter, so you don't get to see the feature that gives them their name. In breeding plumage, they have a sort of a maroon little stripe down under the throat there that almost looks like it's red flannel, maroon colored flannel. Handsome birds. And then the common loon, the big boy, this is the one of, you know, on Golden Pond, the one that has the fabulous vocalizations that you hear in the evening if you spend any time up north or whatever. Big birds and big flippers hanging out behind, heavy chisel-like bill. Again, this is a winter plumage bird, like the red-throated loon. They have two different plumages. That's one thing about scoters and eiders. They don't really change their plumages other than during the eclipse molt, but they're still pretty recognizable for what they are. But eiders I should have mentioned this when I was talking about eiders. Eiders take about 3 years before they acquire their full breeding plumage in the case of the males. So you see a lot of birds that are sort of tweeners, as we say. You're not really sure whether they're males or females or what they are. But the common loon, again, is widespread across the country. You know, even in the West, if there's a big lake or whatever, common loons will typically stop there during migration, or they'll be there in the winter. They migrate overland, obviously, and there's a big common loon survey that takes place annually out at Cayuga Lake out near Cornell, where they monitor common loons. Up at Lake Champlain, there's a big flight of common loons that comes down Lake Champlain through Vermont and so on. So they're a bird that you're going to see. But by the time most of them get here in the fall and winter, they look like the bird here in flight, you know, white underneath and just dark on top. But in flight at a distance, they don't travel in big groups the way red-throated loons often do. And, you know, at Manomet, for example, a lot of times they'll be quite high and quite far offshore, but sometimes they'll be flying, they come right over the point, literally. I mean, they fly over your head. So if you're ever out there sea watching, look in all the right directions. So that's the cast of characters, and I will move this along now. A few facts and figures. Most species, as you've seen, are migratory. Most of them breed north of Massachusetts. Most forage on a variety of foods obtained in a variety of ways, primarily diving. And for many of them, it's on shellfish, whereas in the case of mergansers, it's finfish. Food availability and breeding success often determine how common they are. That is to say, some years we get much bigger flights than others. Some of that's determined by weather and where the flight line that they use. But it's also a function of whether they had a good breeding season. Numbers vary from year to year, and waterfowl and gulls are especially common. These would be other wings over the water that you certainly could see, but I just chose to feature mainly waterfowl this evening. So there's a blue mussel, and there's a sand lance, and suffice to say that the blue mussel is sort of the premier food for several of the species that I featured there, the three scoters and the eider, and to a lesser extent, long-tailed ducks, and all of those species will also take clams. Even razor clams are manageable by eiders. They can take all sorts of stuff. Eiders will also take things like green crabs and things. Sometimes you'll see one come up with a crab wiggling and squiggling, and they'll pull off a leg and the crab will start to sink. They'll eat the leg, then they'll dive down. They'll bring the crab back up, pull off another leg. It's just like you would a lobster bake or something. And the little sand lance, while it's not the preferred fin fish of the red-breasted merganser, a great many other seabirds, including terns and so forth, this is a primary source of food, just as it is for most of the baleen whales, other than the right whale, which is feeding on copepods, little tiny planktonic organisms. So how do they get them? Well, I've pretty much given you the details here. Some of them swim around on the surface and pick food from the surface. A bird like the Bonaparte's gull, that's what they do a lot. So if you're familiar with Bonaparte's gulls, they don't drop clams on your car in the parking lot, and they're not looking for garbage at the dumps. They're tending to take their food off the surface of the water. The birds that die from the surface, like loons, for example, they're using their feet for propulsion. Their wings are held tight to their body, and all of their propulsion is done with their feet. Cormorants are the same way. Birds that die from the surface and use their wings for propulsion, alcids, things like razorbills and puffins and dovekies and those things, they use their wings underwater. Sea ducks partially use their wings. In other words, when they dive, they partially open their wings. So they kind of steer and propel themselves, but their feet are really major propulsion body parts. Gannets, I put in here because sometimes you can see lots of gannets along the coast, and they're really large birds. They're the largest seabird in the North Atlantic. The adults are gleaming white with black wingtips. They look like a flying crucifix with a long, sort of pointy bill and quite a long, slender neck and a pointy tail. And very distinctive because when they're feeding, they're diving from the air, often at a great height, big splash going under the water and capturing fish beneath the surface and then bringing them back up. Scavenging, you don't have to go to Manamint Point, go to McDonald's or any place where there's French fries and things that they can glean that way. But the gulls are ubiquitous, shall we say. And then, again, this particular image was taken from another talk. So I had some things with shorebirds like purple sandpipers that feed on rocks. And then if you sort of finally figure out what are the factors that influence their distribution, bottom contour, in other words, a sandy bottom isn't particularly good for birds that are feeding on mussels, because mussels need substrate that they can grab hold on. I mentioned the long-tailed ducks needing food that's in the water column in the form of amphipods. That's a little different than what the scoters and eiders and things are looking for. Depth is important for the divers if they have to get down to the bottom to get their food off the bottom. In some cases, upwelling is very important. This is where there are currents underwater that are coming to the surface and bringing food with it. Things like alcids particularly are looking for these areas that are called frontal areas, where water masses of different types come together, or where there's a lot of upwelling and bringing nutrients to the surface, because that's where the fish that they're looking for are located. Ocean fronts, that would be the kind of thing where you have the Gulf Stream against the waters on either side of it. Those are called fronts. And that's really more for pelagic birds. Surface temperature is important, and I think I gave you a clue in terms of how surface temperature may be a factor in influencing the distribution, even of some of the sea ducks, particularly things like longtails, where the plankton that they're working on, the amphipods, may be affected by water temperature. Currents, same kind of thing as the fronts and convergences. And then, of course, for the scavengers, which really doesn't apply to any of the ducks, it would be just the presence of food or waste from fishing vessels and that kind of thing. Ducks are pretty cool. They're pretty much their own people. And I think, mercifully, that's it. So I hope I haven't put you to sleep, but if I have, I hope you had a good snooze. And as I said, if any of you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. And it's so weird. It seems like most of the birding related things that I'm doing these days, I'm doing where I don't even see who's listening or not, because these Zoom events and others are seemingly the order of the day these days. But if any of you do have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if not, I will thank you for at least signing up and supporting the Wildlands Trust, because even though the birds that I've been talking about here are not particularly utilizing Wildland Trust landscapes, the organization is doing great work, and I would be remiss if I didn't give a plug for Rachel and the job that she's done with the education stuff, and the trust as a whole for the land protection that they're engaged in. So Rachel, if there's any questions, I'll take them now. Otherwise.
Thank you, Wayne. That was great. So again, if you want to put a question into the chat, you can put a question in the chat, which one just came through. If you want to raise your hand, you just go to the participants window and click on raise hand on the bottom right. The question in the chat is from Sue. She says, thanks very much from Australia.
Oh, wow.
I hope to get there one day to see all these wonderful birds. That is
Down
so
under.
Cool.
Well, is she in Australia as we speak?
I believe so. And I didn't realize it wasn't a question, more of a statement, but she says, thank you from Australia. That's awesome.
I think it's amazing that an Aussie would take a Wildlands Trust program. I think awesome.
That might be a record. We've had people from Canada and Texas and the West Coast, but Australia is a first for us.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've only been to Australia once, and it's one of the few places, not one of the few places, one of the many places, I should say, that I'd love to get back to. So someday.
Well, thank you, Sue. If anybody is having trouble figuring out the hand raise feature, you can just take yourself off mute and ask a question now if you'd like to. I know sometimes people can't find that.
And it's fine. Don't think you don't have to squeeze the onion to get people to ask questions. Maybe they don't have any questions, and that's fine. No worries.
Well, Wayne, why don't I have you send me whatever you like, links or any other information that you'd like to share with people in a follow-up email, and I'll get that email out to everybody tomorrow morning. And it will include a link to the recording of this program, as well as, links to Wildlands Trust membership and other information and an evaluation as well.
Yeah, and I tell you what I can do. I will send you a list of, several references that for people that are really interested in ducks and waterfowl and some of the stuff that I was alluding to rather frequently. And then they can track them down on their own. Some of them are older publications that probably you would have to either get them from a library, or if you wanted to obtain a copy from someplace like ABE Books or Amazon.com or one of those places. But there are some really fine waterfowl books. I mean, waterfowl are very, very popular because there's really two audiences, well, three. There's artists, there's sportsmen, and there's birdwatchers. So that between those three audiences alone, there's a lot of waterfowl literature, and because they're aesthetically very appealing, I think that's part of the reason for their popularity. And so there's a lot of good stuff. But I'll give you several sources of information that might be of interest to people.
Awesome, thank you. And, Wayne talked a lot about Manomet Point. That's definitely a good place. It's open to the public that you can go park and look for some of these birds as they're flying south.
That's the nice thing about Manomet Point. It is, you can just drive out there and you can sit in your car, and if it's cold and windy from the right direction, you can stay fairly warm and you can watch the birds go by from your window. I'm not exaggerating. I mean, if you've never seen the phenomenon, next day or so that we get some good cold wind, as I said, north or northeast, that's when you want to be there. When it's more unpleasant for you as an observer, that's when the watching is the best.
Yeah, some of our field trips the last few years have been too warm.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have much cold weather anymore.
I know.
foliage this year. I mean, we've had a drought. We were so happy to have a day of rain yesterday. And, you know, there hasn't been the kind of weather that really it seemed to be more frequent in the fall. But
Well, we might have some good, you know, nice, cool, sunny days coming up Saturday afternoon, and I think Sunday as well this weekend. So get out there, enjoy.
that's
If you have
right.
any questions at all, always feel free to reach out to me. And Wayne, you had said, should I give everybody your email address as well?
Sure.
Okay.
It's
All right.
oh, all right. I'll put it on the thing, or you have it.
I already have it, so I can send
Yep.
that follow-up email.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Wayne, so much. That was great. It's always so nice to have you. Thanks for doing this for us.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Goodbye. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.